It's a Tuesday night. Zara is at her kitchen table with a pen, a notepad, and a pile of bills she has sorted into 2 stacks, the ones she can pay this month and the ones she can't. She's done this before. She'll do it again. She isn't panicking. She isn't frozen. She is doing what she always does, moving numbers around until something fits. Her daughter's school trip is due Friday. The car insurance comes out Thursday. The rent went up again in January. She picks up the pen. She starts with rent. There's no inheritance coming, no parental safety net, no cousin who can float her a few hundred until payday. There is just Zara, this table, and the math she has to make work. She's been making it work her whole life. What she doesn't know yet, what no one has ever said out loud to her, is that this table, these bills, this Tuesday night, were designed long before she was born. What Zara is living right now has a name. Economists call it the wealth gap, specifically the racial wealth gap. But that phrase flattens something that should feel sharp, so let me say it plainly. In the United States, the median white family holds roughly 8 times the wealth of the median black family. Not income, not earnings, wealth. The assets you own. The money you could actually access in a crisis, the foundation under your feet when the ground shifts. And that gap is not shrinking. Research published in 2024 from the Samuel DuBois Cook Center for Social Equity at Duke University found that the racial wealth gap is not only persistent, it is growing. The pandemic made it wider. A rising economic tide, as the researchers put it, lifted all boats inequitably. Here's the part that should get your attention. That gap didn't happen because of effort or talent or choices. It happened because of policy. It was deliberately built, systematically maintained, and in critical ways is still being actively fed today through the tax code, the housing market, and the financial system itself. The mechanism at the center of it is something most people think of as private and personal, something that feels like a family matter, not a political one. It's called inheritance, and it is one of the most powerful engines of inequality operating in plain sight.
Let's go back to 1944. President Roosevelt signs the GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It is one of the most ambitious social programs in American history. Free college tuition, low-interest home mortgages, business loans, unemployment insurance. For 16 million returning veterans, it is the infrastructure of a new middle class. Over the following decade, those benefits translate into homes in newly built suburbs. Those homes gain value. That value becomes equity. That equity funds the next generation's college tuition, down payments, business ventures. The GI Bill doesn't just lift one generation, it launches a compounding chain of wealth that is still running today. But here's what the history books often leave out. 1.2 million black veterans came home from the same war. They had fought in the same theaters, under the same flag, in the segregated units the United States military maintained until 1948. And when they returned, the GI Bill was administered in a way that systematically shut them out. The bill itself did not mention race. It didn't need to. Implementation was delegated to local institutions, banks, universities, regional VA offices that were operating inside Jim Crow America. Southern Democrats had specifically structured the bill this way to give states control, knowing exactly what that control would produce. What it produced? Banks refused to offer GI Bill mortgages in black neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration had been actively redlining since the 1930s, grading neighborhoods by race on color-coded maps and refusing to insure mortgages in areas designated non-white. The VA could co-sign loans but couldn't actually guarantee them, which left white-run financial institutions free to simply refuse. Black veterans who managed to secure loans were pushed into redlined neighborhoods where property values were artificially suppressed by the segregation itself, meaning their homes appreciated far more slowly than those in white suburbs. For the black veterans who received GI benefits at all, those benefits were only 40% of what white veterans received.
And on the education side, 95% of black veterans were effectively forced to attend all black colleges, which were already overcrowded before the influx of returning veterans. The institutions white America used to gild its post-war professional class were largely closed. The numbers that came out of this are staggering. Researchers at Brandeis University's Institute for Economic and Racial Equity tracked the actual wealth consequences across generations. The families of white World War II veterans held on average 32 times the wealth of the families of black World War II veterans. Not in 1944, today. Historian Ira Katznelson, who wrote the definitive account of this period, concluded that there was no greater instrument for widening the racial wealth gap in post-war America than the GI Bill, a program officially open to everyone, administered to benefit almost exclusively white families, whose effects are still compounding 80 years later. That is the origin. Now, here's how the machine runs today. The starting balance. The average wealth of white households is roughly 6 times that of black and Hispanic households, a gap that has been widening, not closing, for 4 decades. Wealth compounds. A family with assets can absorb a medical emergency, a job loss, a car repair without going into debt. A family without assets cannot. Every crisis that hits a low-wealth household doesn't just hurt, it destroys whatever accumulation has managed to build. The gap grows every time the economy shocks, and it shocks the bottom harder every time. The anticipation effect. This one is psychological, and it is devastating in its subtlety. Researchers studying inheritance behavior have found that just the anticipation of a future gift or inheritance allows white families to make riskier financial decisions, investing in stocks, starting a business, making a down payment, because they have a backstop they can count on. The safety net doesn't just catch you when you fall, it changes what you're willing to attempt before you fall. A family that knows help is coming will take the investment. A family that knows no help is coming will not. The gap in ambition isn't character, it's the rational response to different risk environments. The asset class problem. Stock equity makes up nearly 30% of average white household wealth, but only 4% of average black household wealth. Stock equity appreciates faster than housing equity, dramatically faster in periods of market growth. Most black families who build wealth built it through home ownership, which was the only asset class they had meaningful access to. Most white families diversified into equities earlier and more broadly, because inherited capital gave them the liquidity to do so. Same economy, profoundly different machinery. And crucially, when the housing market crashes, the damage falls hardest on those whose wealth is concentrated there. Which brings us to 2008. The 2008 financial crisis is often told as a story of universal suffering. It was not. It was a story of targeted extraction followed by differential destruction. In the years leading up to the crash, major financial institutions flooded black and Latino neighborhoods with subprime mortgage products. High-cost, high-risk loans pushed aggressively on communities that had historically been denied credit. Research published in the American Civil Liberties Union found that higher-income black Americans were 3 times as likely as higher-income white Americans to receive subprime loans. Not lower income, higher income. People who qualified for prime loans were being steered into predatory ones specifically because of race, specifically because segregation had concentrated them in neighborhoods that mortgage brokers could efficiently target. When the bubble burst, half of the collective wealth of black families was lost during the Great Recession, while Latino families lost 67%. And the recovery that followed, a decade of historically low interest rates that made refinancing cheap and investment easy, was, by design, only accessible to those who had survived the crash with their credit and capital intact. That group was disproportionately white. The people who had been stripped of their assets in 2008 were largely locked out of the recovery that followed. The education illusion.
Here is what no one says clearly enough about getting a degree. Among white families, having a college degree makes you dramatically more likely to receive an inheritance. White college graduates are 72% more likely to receive transfers than white people without a high school diploma. Among black families, that same gradient is much flatter. The education premium on receiving inheritance transfers is far smaller. The degree doesn't equalize the inheritance gap. It barely touches it. Education opens doors differently depending on what's already waiting behind them. Now let's name who profits from the system as it currently stands. The estate planning industry, lawyers, trust managers, tax architects, a multi-billion-dollar profession built entirely around preserving large private fortunes and minimizing what passes to the public through taxation. The federal tax code itself, specifically a provision called stepped-up basis. Here is how it works. When you buy an asset, a stock, a property, and it gains value over your lifetime, that gain is taxable when you sell. But if you die holding the asset, the gain is wiped clean. Your heir inherits the asset at its current market value. The decades of appreciation simply disappear from the tax base. In 2019, 56% of the benefits of stepped-up basis, roughly $22 billion, went to the top 20% of estates, with $7 billion going to the top 1% alone. The provision has been on the books since 1927. It was drafted with the help of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, the son of one of the wealthiest families of his era, who had written explicitly about his hatred of inheritance taxation. It has never required a justification. It simply persists. For families wealthy enough to use it aggressively, the strategy is known as buy, borrow, die. Buy appreciating assets. Borrow against them to fund your lifestyle. Loans aren't taxable income. Die holding the assets. Your heirs inherit a stepped-up basis and own nothing on a lifetime of gains. The wealth transfers, untaxed, across generations, compounding into dynasties. Inheritances account for approximately 40% of all household wealth in the United States, and that wealth is heavily concentrated at the top. Center on budget and policy priorities, the estate tax, which was designed to interrupt dynastic accumulation, now applies to fewer than 1 in every 1,000 estates. In 2017, its exemption was doubled to $22 million per couple. The families who benefit from this are not paying for it. Everyone else. Zara finishes her list. She can cover rent. The car insurance gets paid if she pushes back the school trip deposit by 2 weeks. She'll call the teacher in the morning. The credit card minimum goes on the card she's been trying to pay down since last winter. The numbers don't balance. They fit, which is different. She doesn't feel relief. She feels the particular tiredness that comes from not sleeping enough, but from thinking this hard, this carefully, every single month just to stay in place. She thinks about her mother. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her mother saved. Her mother kept a budget on a notepad that looked a lot like this one. And her mother never had anything to leave her, not because she didn't try, because everything she built kept getting taken back. The car that broke down in 2004 and wiped out 3 months of savings. The hospital bill in 2009 that turned into debt that took 6 years to clear. The rent that doubled when the neighborhood changed and her mother had no equity to leverage, no property to sell, nowhere to go but further out. Every time wealth started to build, something came for it, and there was no buffer, no cushion, no parental backstop, just the math. Restarted every time. Zara knows this is not bad luck. She is too clear-eyed for that. She just doesn't have a name for the architecture yet. She closes the notepad. She'll do this again next month. Zara's mother's story, wealth accumulated and then stripped, is not a personal narrative.
It is a pattern so consistent it has been documented across generations in peer-reviewed research. Thomas Shapiro, a sociologist at Brandeis University who tracked the same families across 25 years, found that inheritances converted to wealth very differently depending on race. Each dollar inherited contributed to 91 cents of lasting wealth for white families. For African American families, the same dollar contributed only 20 cents of lasting wealth for white families. The Heller School. The reason isn't the money itself, it's that black families typically need to deploy inherited funds immediately for emergency savings, for debt repayment, for covering the gaps that no safety net closes. White families inherit into stability. Black families inherit into need, and the inheritance gets absorbed by the need before it can compound. This is the inheritance gap operating at its most granular level, not just who receives money, but what the money is able to become once it arrives, and the research is clear that this isn't closing. A 2024 paper from Duke University explicitly corrected President Biden's 2024 State of the Union claim that the racial wealth gap was at its smallest in 20 years. The authors found the opposite was true. The gap had expanded with the onset of the pandemic and continues to grow. The story of black-white wealth inequality in the United States, they write, is one of the typical white household consistently having more, and the typical black household holding a relatively small percentage of white wealth, and that percentage is declining. This pattern holds globally wherever colonial dispossession and racialized housing policy created differential starting positions. In the United Kingdom, research has consistently shown that wealth transfers from older to younger generations overwhelmingly benefit families who already own property, with renters, disproportionately drawn from minority communities, structurally excluded from the equity gains that have driven British wealth accumulation since the 1980s. In Australia, the superannuation system, compulsory employer-contributed retirement savings, partially mitigates the inheritance gap for workers who access it, but Indigenous Australians face persistent disparities in home ownership and formal employment that limit what that system can provide. The mechanism differs by country, the structure of who it advantages does not. If you've watched episode 2 of this channel, you'll recognize something here. We talked about the bandwidth tax, the cognitive and financial cost of operating without a buffer, of making every decision under conditions of scarcity. The inheritance gap is the structural version of that tax, imposed not month by month, but generation by generation. Every generation that begins without assets must spend energy and income building a base that wealthy families inherited before they turned 18. It's worth watching if you haven't yet. So what actually interrupts this? There are real interventions, with evidence, with names, with places where they've been tried. The most significant structural policy proposal in the United States is baby bonds, publicly funded child savings accounts seeded at birth with larger amounts for lower wealth families, accessible at adulthood for asset-building purposes, a home, a business, an education. The concept was developed by economists Derek Hamilton and William Darity Jr. and is grounded in a simple argument. If the inheritance gap is structural, the remedy has to be structural too. You cannot close a wealth gap by addressing income alone. You have to build assets from the beginning. In June 2021, Connecticut became the first U.S. state to pass a baby bonds law, establishing a $3,200 account at birth for every child born into a Medicaid-eligible household. Those accounts are projected to grow to between $11,000 and $24,000 by adulthood. Connecticut has now enrolled over 33,000 children. Washington, D.C. and California followed. A 2019 analysis by researcher Naomi Zaweed projected that a federal baby bonds program could reduce the median racial wealth gap between young white and black Americans from a factor of 16 to a factor of 1.4. That is not elimination, but it is the architecture of a different starting line. On the tax side, closing stepped-up basis, the provision that allows capital gains to vanish at death, would, according to the Congressional Budget Office, raise roughly $100 billion over 10 years. That money currently disappears into dynastic wealth. It doesn't have to. Community land trusts, where land is held collectively by a nonprofit, removing it from the speculative market while residents own their homes on long-term leases, have demonstrated that homeownership can be made durable and accessible for low-income families without the volatility that wipes wealth out. The Champlain Housing Trust in Burlington, Vermont, one of the oldest in the United States, has kept homes affordable and buildable for over 40 years. During the 2008 crash, its homeowners experienced dramatically lower foreclosure rates than the surrounding market. None of these alone closes the gap, but each one attacks the mechanism, the compounding system that turns historical exclusion into contemporary inevitability. Here is what I want you to hold on to. Zara is not behind because she didn't try hard enough. She is behind because the starting line was never in the same place. Her mother wasn't unlucky. Her mother was navigating a system that extracted wealth from families like hers and transferred it upward repeatedly with the full machinery of the state, housing policy, tax law, mortgage markets, providing the infrastructure. The people who benefit from that system will tell you inheritance is a private family matter, that what a parent leaves a child is none of the government's business, that the wealth gap is an unfortunate but organic outcome of individual effort playing out over generations. But redlining was a government program. The GI Bill's exclusions were a government decision. Stepped-up basis was written in 1927 by a Treasury Secretary from one of America's richest families who hated inheritance taxes, and it is compounded in his family's favor ever since. The doubling of the estate tax exemption in 2017 was a legislative choice made by elected representatives. Every piece of the machine was built by human hands in service of specific interests, which means human hands can dismantle it. Not easily, not in one election cycle, not with one policy or one program. But the precondition for any of that is something more basic. You have to see it first. Zara, at her kitchen table, moving numbers around until they fit, she is not failing. She is navigating a system that was engineered to extract from her and called the result her fault. Now you know what it's called, and you know who built it. If you know there's a need for someone to know this, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone.